Hello and welcome to the Blue Goat Cyber monthly webinar. I'm joined here with Christian Espinosa, our CEO and founder. I'm Trevor Slattery, the CTO here at Blue Goat Cyber. And today we're talking about 5 cybersecurity myths that can break medtech startups and some of the strategies that we've seen as successful to beat them globally. First things I'll check in. How are you doing today, Christian?
I'm doing pretty good. A little bit jet lagged. I just got back from the Samora in Kenya last night. So it's about 40 hours of travel, and it's an altitude there. It's like a little sunburn on my face, which has been kind of irritating. But these are all first world problems, really.
Not a bad problem to have in December either.
What, being sunburned?
Yeah, being sunburned. I haven't seen the sun in quite some time out here.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. Cool. How are you doing in San Fran these days?
Also just finished some travel, not 40 hours, but 8.5 coming back from Toronto. Was out east for a good amount of time this winter, and so excited to kind of settle in to some warmer weather, even if it is a bit foggy and cloudy out here. But gearing up for JP Morgan week in a couple of weeks, and everything's going well.
All right, awesome. Well, you want to kick us off here on the 5 cybersecurity myths?
Let's do it. Well, we'll go ahead and just jump right in. Now, before we get into some of the myths and then some of the solutions that we see to help deal with problems that medtech innovators face, it's important to first cover why is cybersecurity important. Now, when we're dealing with medical devices, an example that I always give for anyone who's familiar with traditional cybersecurity, you're going to see a lot of differences. When we're thinking about cybersecurity within a medical device, what we're really thinking about is patient safety. If there's a risk that we can compromise the safety or the effectiveness of a medical device through the means of a cybersecurity vulnerability, this can directly impact the patient and can obviously cause some major downstream implications with the device. This is not going to be the case in a lot of other cybersecurity affected industries. Think of things such as financial data, legal information, even protected health information, while very tightly controlled, while very important, is not going to have the same impact as if a medical device gets compromised. Now, what we want to see is early integration of cybersecurity throughout the product's lifecycle and throughout the overall organizational roadmap of products that medtech innovators are developing. Building this patient safety aspect in earlier is going to lead to investor confidence, regulator trust, and it's going to allow for a more streamlined process with your go-to-market strategy. Cybersecurity is currently the #1 reason that the FDA is pushing back on medical device submissions. So we want to make sure that we're covering all of our bases accurately here. This is a very, very important one to see that we do it right. Now, there are a lot of different regulations out there, and there are a lot of different regulators that are trying to navigate this space. Cybersecurity within medical devices is fairly new in its current state. Obviously, it's been a present consideration for quite some time, but we haven't really seen it at the level that it's currently at until 2023, when the FDA pushed out their, September 2023 cybersecurity guidance. This has since been superseded by the 2025 cybersecurity guidance, but this was really the initial point where cybersecurity started to get serious for medical devices. The FDA oftentimes is seen as having some of the most comprehensive or even the most strict guidelines within cybersecurity, though obviously every regulator has some minor differences. Generally, what we could expect to see is that they are trying to take a fairly harmonized approach through standards such as the IMDRF, the JSP2, IEC 81001-5-1. What we're talking about with all of these are these global lifecycle approaches to cybersecurity. Different regulators try to take a harmonized approach so that while each has minor differences, you can have a single global packet for cybersecurity. Now, this is obviously not going to be the case for every regulator. There are certain regulators where we have some different compliance requirements. Namely, one example that comes up frequently will be the NMPA within China. In addition to any medical device regulations and any prevalent concerns around patient safety, around patient data protection, you have to align with Chinese cyber law, which is going to be very unique compared to traditional cybersecurity requirements in most other countries. Chinese cyber law limits the different types of technology that you can use in your product. It limits the different types of encryption, for an example, that you can use in your product. So oftentimes we're going to see a pretty big distinction between Chinese regulations and between other global regulations. But in general, there is a little bit of a harmonized approach. Now, I know there are quite a few other regulatory agencies that we don't have listed here. The HSA, we have authorities, obviously the HSA being from Singapore, we have authorities from Australia, we have authorities from the Middle East. And so I'd be curious to hear, Christian, if in your experience, these are all taking that fairly harmonized approach, or if there are any other markets that you see as big outliers there.
I agree with your statement about NMPA in China being a little bit different. Everyone else seems to follow the guidance from IMDRF, including the FDA. They've just taken the guidance and made it a little more restrictive in some areas and provided some clarity. But yeah, everyone else is pretty harmonized.
And I think it's a great approach that these regulators are taking to have this harmonized approach. Oftentimes, this is a question that'll come up when we're working with medtech innovators dealing with their first submission having to cover cybersecurity is, well, sure, we're preparing this, we're talking about FDA, but where is this going to work anywhere else? How are we going to have to change this for the PMDA? How are we going to have to change this for the EU MDR? And it's often some amazing news to these innovators that you don't really have to do that much to make sure that you're moving from the FDA to the PMDA or the FDA to the MDR. They are all taking that fairly harmonized approach there. All right, now we're going to dive into a bit more of the detail on these actual myths. Now, the first myth is going to be that it's about the data. I alluded to this a little bit during that initial slide, but this is one of the most common misconceptions that we see when it comes to cybersecurity. And it makes sense. When you think about the history of cybersecurity and ultimately what cybersecurity is trying to do, it's a subset of information technology. Information being data, being the critical concern here.
Well, it used to be called information security back in the day as well.
Yeah, I know we have some pen testers on our team that still talk about their golden days in information security and the switch to when it became penetration testing or cybersecurity and some of those terminology shifts. But regardless of the term around the process, cybersecurity is traditionally about protecting data, protecting information, and preventing criminals from getting access to it. There's a little bit of a different lens when we're looking at it through medical devices. Now, if we take, say, a vulnerability in a system that can cause a denial of service, so it prevents access, prevents usage of the product. If this is a financial system, it's processing financial data or very sensitive information, credit card information, for an example, having a disruption of the service is going to be very inconvenient. There could be a financial impact to that loss. Obviously, if that information is compromised by an attacker, that can be a major problem. But I'm going to present the same situation if this is for an autonomous surgical robot during the middle of surgery. If it is vulnerable to a denial of service vulnerability that can be executed in the system and then the surgical robot can no longer perform the surgery, that is a massive safety concern. There's immediate risk of loss of life in that situation. This is the primary lens that we want to look at when we're dealing with medical device cybersecurity. The compromise in effectiveness and safety of a device through cybersecurity risks is a very real problem. We want to make sure that we're covering all of our bases there.
I think this, I'm glad we put this as number one because I was at an event not too long ago and it wasn't really an argument, but it was a discussion with an investor. And she swore that it's not about patient safety, that it's just about the data. She says cybersecurity equals data protection. I'm like, no, it doesn't in terms of medical devices. And I was surprised as an investor in medical technology that that was still the lens. And I think that's the lens a lot of people are looking at it through, that it's about, protected health information and the data. And maybe it's just because we do this every day, so we know differently and it's relatively new that it's about patient safety. How can we harm a patient or kill a patient by hacking into a device?
Yep, and it's a very different lens that we're looking at through things here, but it does make sense. Anytime you hear about traditional concerns with cybersecurity, I see we actually did just get a comment in that
It's right
ties
here.
in
Yeah.
this point very well. Anytime you hear about cybersecurity in the news, it's about ransomware. You think about pipeline ransomware, or certain casinos getting hacked, or any big attacks against healthcare networks. And what we're looking at is trying to lock down a system, steal their information, and then try to essentially ransomware or ransom the organization that you deployed the ransomware within. This is another major risk that medical device manufacturers have to face. So ransomware has a very dangerous downstream effect. It is not a targeted attack. It is prolific. It'll try to run through a network as quickly as possible and take over as many machines as it can find. If your device acts as a starting point, or even a just accidental victim of ransomware, this is going to immediately compromise the safety of your device, in addition to a lot of the other devices within the network. Part of where these regulations came in, actually the source and one of the big driving factors for the FDA to try to step up their cybersecurity posture, was the WannaCry ransomware attack in 2017. They saw this as a major problem with how medical devices are integrated into healthcare environments. They wanted to find a way to try to bridge that gap. So ransomware is a great example of another problem that we see as a very, very dangerous concern within medical devices. All right, now jumping over to myth number 2, my device isn't a cyber device. And I think that there are a couple of reasons that this is a very common issue that we face, and it's partially due to ambiguity from the regulators' definitions. They've been working on this a little bit, but backing out, what we want to determine is whether or not we have to comply with cybersecurity regulations for a medical device. That is, whether or not it's a cyber device. The FDA publishes criteria on what makes a cyber device. It has to have code or software or firmware that is validated and running on the device. It has to have some form of network connectivity. And we're going to follow up on that point in a second, since that is the point that really gets people caught up. And then the system has to be vulnerable to some sort of cybersecurity risk. Now, I will say that third point can be a little bit of a moot point. It can be difficult to argue that any device with software is not vulnerable to cybersecurity risk. I know one of our more senior testers on our team will frequently reference his master's thesis, where he was trying to prove that a piece of software had 0 vulnerabilities. It was 3 lines of code long and took him over 50 pages of proof to prove that there was no vulnerability in that code. So now,
Was he able to prove it, actually?
He was able to prove it, but
Three lines of code, you said.
That was only 3 lines of code.
Okay.
So now if we imagine the exact same thing with 10,000 or even 100,000 lines of code, you can imagine proving that that is not subject to cybersecurity risk is going to be a very difficult task. Now, the first point that we talked about, having software, firmware, running code, that's going to be fairly self-explanatory. A massive majority of medical devices now have some sort of software running in them. They're smart devices in one way or another. But the second point that we talked about, that network connectivity, this is oftentimes where you might think network connectivity. It connects to the internet. It connects to a network. It doesn't just stop there. We have to think about things such as Bluetooth. That is considered network connectivity by the FDA. We have to think of things such as a USB port, an HDMI cable even can allow for network connectivity for a medical device. You can think of NFC, which is the same technology that your credit card uses on tap to pay. There is no electronic data transfer. It's through magnetic induction coils. So that's not even technically an electronic interface, and it is still considered a network interface. I think this is probably where most people are getting confused, but I'd also be curious to hear your thoughts on that, Christian.
I agree. This is a point of confusion. The way I like to say is, if it has software in any type of interface, it's best to have a conversation with us, because more than likely it is a cyber device. I know technically there's a third criteria the FDA has, that it could have a vulnerability to a cyber attack, but that, I think that that criteria can kind of be ignored, because pretty much anything can have a vulnerability at some point in time. But yeah, even things like RFID is a interface. And one of the points of confusion we see quite often is a lot of medtech innovators will tell us they have a device, but they have a USB port that is only used for maintenance. So depending on how that USB port is accessed, can determine if it's a cyber device or not. And maybe you want to expand on that a little bit, Trevor, but I'm talking about, does somebody have to dismantle the device or use a specific type of tool to get to that USB port? If not, then it technically is a cyber device.
Exactly. So just kind of following up on that, we'll assume that we have a device similar to your phone where there's a USB port on the outside. If it's expected that a service technician just plugs something into that phone, it could be a cable to their laptop, it could be maybe a flash drive with a piece of software on it, whatever it might be. And then there's something that happens to the device. That is going to be some form of network connectivity or some form of interoperability that you need to protect. Maybe you need to have a specific key on that thumb drive. Otherwise, it's not going to recognize it and it won't boot up at all. Or maybe you need to have a password that you put in to even get the connection to recognize from the computer. Now, when we still have this level of access, it is going to be very difficult to argue against it being a cyber device, even though it is such a minimal functionality. If we were able to say, bury it deep within the device, you have to peel back the casing, replace tamper evident stickers on it, and then you still have to go through these layers of authentication. That's when you have an easier argument to make with the FDA. There's no way to access these interfaces on the system. So when we're trying to think about a cyber device, not just the interfaces, but how we're accessing them is a very, very important consideration as well. And it's going to vary a little bit about specific devices, of course. And so if you have any questions, that's a great time to reach out to us, and then we can help you with that assessment on that side of things. All right. Now, jumping into myth 3, cybersecurity is a one-time study. This is often going to come up from the way that other studies or other parts of a submission are handled. You can think about your 60601 testing. You can think about your clinical trials. You can think about your biocompatibility, your usability testing, all of these different studies that you have to go through in preparation for a regulatory submission are generally done at a single point of time to prove the effectiveness, to prove the safety, to prove the usability of a product. Now,
before we jump into myth 3 too much, I know there's a question that kind of came in. I think it's a good analogy here. I'm going to go ahead and show it if you want to discuss it a little bit here, Trevor, because we talked about labeling a little bit, but we didn't get into the nuts and bolts of it when you talked about tamper-proof seals, for instance.
It's 2026. I'm on a mission to make sure that everyone has a nutrition facts label for everything in medtech. This is actually a great thing that we like to see covered. And the FDA even has some processes around how they want to see that. So I think this is partially alluding to is some of the controls or some of the processes around documenting what goes into a product. So we'll dive into a little bit of the details in a bit here on exactly how we want to see this covered. But one thing that is very important as part of this continuous process is documenting everything within the device and then documenting how that changes. So I know the analogy that you always give, Christian, is if you're going and buying a car, it is your right as the purchaser of that car to know who makes the engine, who makes the tires, who makes the seats, who makes every single part of this vehicle. Why should a medical device be any different? Manufacturers are now required to provide a statement describing all of the third-party software components, all of the hardware components that they're using in their device, so that users are able to make an informed decision on the risk that they may or may not be taking on by using this device. It's a very important step in the transparency of the industry, and it ties into the cyclical process that we want to see as part of a secure product development framework. Now, these components within a medical device are going to change as the device changes, as minor changes happen to software, and it's expected that they change. You may not necessarily change the casing of a medical device for years or even decades if it still works and if it is still compliant. But software is going to become deprecated, new vulnerabilities are going to get discovered, and the expectation is that you are continually changing this while still providing transparency on what goes into the product. Now, because of this continually evolving nature of cybersecurity and because of the way that software is continually evolving, it's a different approach. We aren't just taking it as a point-in-time snapshot, as we might for some of these other studies that I mentioned earlier. It's something that we need to bake into the early design of the product and then have continuous testing going on all the way through the full life cycle of the product. Cybersecurity testing Certain testing activities should be done at specific intervals, and some testing should be done nearly 24/7 against the device, such as reference against your software bill of materials, or essentially that nutrition facts label for a medical device. That should be a continuous process. You should never have downtime on reviewing any components within your SBOM. So this can't be seen as just a point in time snapshot.
That's
When we're looking,
like you like to say, is from design to disposal. So we got the whole pre-market cybersecurity, and you've also got post-market. So it's has to be looked at for the entire product life cycle.
exactly. And there are some great frameworks to look at it through this full product life cycle. I know we have some examples here. The JSP2, IEC 81001-5-1 are some commonly referenced overall total life cycle approaches to medical device cybersecurity. And it's a great way to make sure that you have that design to disposal coverage all the way through. All right, now myth number 4. And this one is not so much a myth in the cybersecurity industry, but maybe in the more medtech industry, is that developers are going to understand cybersecurity.
It's a little bit controversial, some people like to say.
It is a little bit controversial. A lot of developers do understand cybersecurity. A lot of developers think that they understand cybersecurity. It is a tricky one to navigate for sure, and they're ultimately just two sides of the same software problem. But creating the software and then breaking and trying to hack into the software are very different situations. Now, I also see that we have a comment around myth 3 here. Sounds a lot like how technical documentation is handled in Europe. Technical documentation and clinical documentation is assessed on a sampling basis, at least yearly. There are some cases where we have similar review processes within the FDA, within the US. But it's not done on such a continuous basis. It is generally done as specific intervals where you're going through certain rounds of testing, or you'll have certain requirements depending on your regulatory path. For an example, with a PMA submission to the FDA, you're required to deliver an annual report about the clinical effectiveness, about a whole range of different activities within your device. But oftentimes this can slip a little bit to the wayward, as with cybersecurity. It can be treated as an initial process. It's not something where continuous penetration testing or continuous security testing is kept up with. So we really do want to make sure that that's covered there.
It needs to be done at least yearly, as Raphael said, though, as well.
Exactly. It's something that we need to see done at least yearly. We've seen the FDA shifting around some of their acceptance for the recency of penetration test reports. Recently, we had a prospect come to us with a deficiency that they'd received from the FDA, saying that they wanted to see penetration testing within 6 months of submission. So we're trying to make sure that we're keeping these timelines as tight as possible and as continuous as possible. Now, as part of that, with the continuous development, continuous deployment, and the integration of the code within a medical device, we need to make sure that we're addressing cybersecurity well there. I think part of the issue in this space, and something that we've talked about quite a few times before, Christian, is this mindset of move fast and break things that came up from the Silicon Valley startup craze. This does not work as well in medical devices. Regulated software development is slow. It needs to be careful. You need to cover cybersecurity. You need to have multiple hands in the cookie jar, making sure that everything is safe. It's not going to be the same as just trying to create a product, get it out there, see if it works. You need to be very careful. You need to be very intentional, and you need to have independent testing done against this, which is often going to be unique in certain industries. If you're looking for HIPAA compliance, SOC 2 Type 2, or FDA compliance, this is where they're going to want to see this independent testing. It is very, very important that your developers have a good understanding of cybersecurity, but you can't expect them to do the cybersecurity testing. You can't expect them to try to cover all of these cybersecurity activities that they may not be as experienced with. That's when having a dedicated software team and then having either in-house or an externally sourced cybersecurity team to complement the software team is a great strategy.
Yeah, because they're different skill sets, as we like to say. Software developers are great at building things. Cybersecurity professionals are typically great at breaking things. So we look at the same code through a very different lens.
Exactly. And I think one thing that comes up as just a more general cybersecurity misconception, not even a bit of a tangent away from this, but is that if you're a penetration tester, you need to know how to code. Many of the penetration testers I know don't really know how to code, but what most penetration testers do know inside and out better than most developers is how networks work, how computers talk to each other, how these different communications are handled, which is what cybersecurity is the most focused on. We're not as focused on how to actually build the product. We're focused on how this data is moved around, how we can try to compromise this data, compromise the effectiveness of a product. And so it's just a different lens that we're looking at, like you said, but they're both obviously very important sides of the same conversation. You can't have a product without the developers, and you can't secure it without cybersecurity.
Yeah, and developers look at the proper use cases. We look at abuse cases. We look
Exactly.
at how can we make this thing do something it wasn't intended to do? So it's a very, like I said, very different test case.
If a cybersecurity team was designing a product of any kind, medical device or not, the way that they would say it's perfectly safe is they would have no interfaces on it. They would put it in the box and they would bury that box in the desert in Nevada. And they would say nobody can hack into that device. And they'd be correct, but there's got to be some balance in between.
Well, you already gave up too much information. You said Nevada. So now we can narrow our search.
Oh, well, there you go. I gave it all away. All right, now our fifth myth is that cybersecurity equals cybersecurity. And I know we talked a little bit about this point earlier, but it is really not the case that medical device cybersecurity is the same as IT cybersecurity. On one hand, we're dealing with patient safety, patient harm. Our primary concern is going to be the integrity of results, the safety of a patient, the usefulness of a product. And on the other hand, we're dealing with more traditional information technology, cybersecurity. How can we protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data?
Yeah, none of those three focus on patient harm, do they?
No, they don't.
That's a traditional cybersecurity triad, as they like to say.
Exactly. But it does make sense. In most other industries, you don't have to think about that patient safety risk. Now, here, obviously, within the medical space, we do. So it is very important. And if you're taking away anything from this conversation, it should be that your primary focus needs to be around patient harm in your product. Confidentiality, integrity, availability are still vital, but patient harm is the paramount focus here.
Yeah, it's the same thing if I'm taking a Waymo or some of the cyber devices these days, or a flying taxi or something. You know that patient harm is or user harm is a big factor these days. It wasn't in the past, but it's becoming more and more prevalent with devices outside of med tech, but devices that have some sort of physical component to them.
Yep. Yeah, it's I know the Waymo example is actually perfect. Just not last night, but the night before here in San Francisco, there was a big power outage and 150.
I saw that Waymo was offline for a while. Was that what happened?
Waymo was offline. It wasn't obeying street signs properly. It wasn't stopping at crosswalks the way it's supposed to. And so they just took Waymo offline. I think it's still limited service within the city. So
why was it not obeying the rules anymore?
Massive power outage. I think the earth is finally swallowing up San Francisco. There have been a bunch of earthquakes and there were flood warnings and there's massive storms coming in. And so it ended up taking out a lot of stuff. The street lights were out for a while here. It was a lot of stuff was going on.
It's interesting. So Waymo did not think of a scenario like, what if the power goes out? How do our Waymos respond?
I guess not. And apparently they don't respond very well. And so that's another situation where that would be, I guess, within the automotive space, but that is introducing some safety risk. If Waymos are not responding to crosswalks properly or stop signs properly, there's a massive risk that can happen there.
Interesting. That's an interesting use case. I know in Dubai, there's been flooding there. You talked about flooding in San Francisco. I don't know. It's because they're trying to make their own rain over there and seed the clouds. It's finally caught up, and massive flooding and things have gone out. They've lost power and things there too.
Oh wow, yeah. Here, I think that's just the way that Northern California is in December.
NorCal. All right.
NorCal. Now, we've talked about some of the big myths that we like to see, and I think now is a great time to talk about the ways that we can try to mitigate some of the problems that come in from internalizing these myths. The first thing that is really important to apply is this dual approach to risk management. We have AMI TR 57 for security risk management within medical devices, which is based on ISO 14971 for just risk management within medical devices. This is more focused around safety risk. It's going to be a little bit more of a general use case. And then AMI-TR 57 is trying to click down a couple of notches and dive more into these security risks. These are unique processes, and they should be unique processes. The FDA explicitly calls out that these should be separate, distinct, but each one talks about the intersection point with the other. When you're conducting a risk assessment on any specific finding that you identify, you should determine, is this only a safety risk? Is this only a security risk? Or is there a chance that there's an intersection that we have to address here? So having this dual approach is very, very important. And of course, mapping everything back to that patient safety is our number one focus and our number one concern. Now, a great way to meet cybersecurity compliance is by chaining together these end-to-end standards that are going to cover cybersecurity and cover safety within medical devices. We talked about ISO 14971 and AMI-TR 57 as different approaches for risk management. They're both very important, but these are not going to be all encompassing. These aren't talking about the life cycle of the product. These aren't talking about the design of the product. These aren't talking about the post-market for the product. So we need to look at different ways to bridge the gap there. Diving into the design and the construction of a product, we like to talk about IEC 62304. This is the golden standard for medical software development. It talks about the different safety classifications, what levels of control should be applicable depending on your risk profile of your device, and how to build a safe and effective product.
Yeah, so if I'm a medtech innovator looking to find a software development company to help me develop my product, they should probably follow IEC 62304. It's a pretty good filter to apply. Exactly.
IEC 62304 is what we want to see for the development practices. And then we don't call it out here, but ISO 13485 is what we're going to want to see for the quality system practices. So how are these engineers creating the quality artifacts that are going to go into your QMS? How are they securely or properly documenting the product that they're developing? I know any engineer will confirm this with you, that writing documentation is the worst part of an engineer's day, but it is very important within the medical device space to make sure that everything is traceable and well documented. Now, this is all going to factor into an end-to-end lifecycle approach. We've talked about a couple of the popular approaches, such as the JSP2, IEC 81001-5-1. These are both going to slightly different goals and slightly different approaches, but what we're trying to look at in general is that manufacturers have a process and a secure, documented, and standardized approach to covering end-to-end cybersecurity, from design all the way down to disposal. There shouldn't be any gaps that are found in that process. You shouldn't have any gaps even during the post-market phase or during your submission. Cybersecurity should be addressed all the way through. Depending on which regulator you're going to be directing your submission to, then there are going to be applicable standards laid out by them. For the FDA specifically, they're talking about pre-market and post-market guidance. There are different activities that they want to see covered in each. There are different criteria that may be applicable for risk assessments in the post-market that aren't applicable in the pre-market. There are some shifting factors that need to be addressed. So understanding how your strategy is going to change from the pre-market moving into that post-market phase is vital to ensure that you have a globally comprehensive and compliant approach. I'd also like to talk about some of the most common startup cybersecurity gaps that we see. Now, we often get a lot of companies coming to us once they have received an AINN or an additional information request from the FDA saying, we were not able to find this, we deemed XYZ to be insufficient, and then we'll dive into the process on how to help them. The first is going to be missing or problems within their SBOM. SBOMs are very important. We talked a little bit about that as far as the list of what goes into a medical device, but there are a list of minimum elements that should be covered within an SBOM set out by the NTIA. And there are some supplementary components the FDA wants to see covered. All of this needs to be structured according to very specific formats. You need to conduct a safety and security assessment of any risks present within the SBOM. There's a lot that can go into this. So we want to make sure that an SBOM is generated, monitored, and assessed using best practice tooling, best practice procedures, and then we have this securely captured and documented for our submission. Another common gap that we'll see is that vulnerabilities are not tied to patient risk. This is going to be back around that traditional IT cybersecurity versus medical cybersecurity. We can't just think about the data, since there is going to be a different facet that we have to consider here. That'll lead us right into insufficient cybersecurity testing. If testing was not done according to FDA reference standards, the main one being NIST Special Publication 800-115, which talks about the process for conducting IT security assessments, or if we do not have sufficient coverage with different types of testing, we may only do penetration testing, but miss fuzz testing, miss static testing, miss testing against the SBOM. There are a lot of different things that can go into insufficient cybersecurity testing. This isn't necessarily going to be a gap that's called out by the FDA, but it's something that we have identified that leads to some of these other gaps. And that's that cybersecurity is handled by your infrastructure IT and quality is not involved. Cybersecurity for a large enterprise network or dealing with cloud infrastructure, on-prem hosted infrastructure, it's going to have different documentation, going to have different process requirements, and trying to throw your general IT staff into this regulated cybersecurity space is generally not going to go super well. They're not going to have the experience for some of the nuances that come into this medical space. This is where we like to see that intersection with the quality team. The quality and regulatory teams are generally going to have a better understanding of what is going into the regulatory process, the documentation that needs to be required, and the cybersecurity team can bridge the technical gaps there. So we want to make sure that the entire organization is working together to have a good strategy here. Another very common gap that we'll see is a weak post-market strategy. This is one of the most important things to present forward to any regulator, is that you have all of your bases covered once the device is cleared and on the market. You want to make sure that your plan is addressing any vulnerabilities that can come up, your timeline for remediation, your process for patch deployment, and that you're still complying with any disclosure requirements or addressing them based on criticality as needed. All right, now this is where we'll dive into some of the case studies. I feel like our list of case studies is growing nearly every day as we're encountering newer and newer situations, especially with the FDA's constantly shifting regulations and practices there. All right, we'll talk about this first one here, where we had a startup manufacturer, or a medical device manufacturer. This was a startup that wasn't as experienced within the regulated cybersecurity space. They were focusing more on HIPAA guidelines, coming from a traditional healthcare background and not looking so much at the patient safety risks. So this is going to go back to where we were talking about that confidentiality, integrity, availability, not looking at patient harm. This was the approach that this manufacturer was taking. Now, what we wanted to see is that we're trying to bridge that gap a little bit. There can be some common cybersecurity scoring tools or some common cybersecurity, risk matrices and risk assessment methodologies that just aren't going to map super well to medical devices. So what we wanted to see as the fix and how we help try to implement some solutions is mapping things back to some of these more global harmonized approaches. In this case, we wanted to look at the JSP2 for the way that they cover cybersecurity life cycles and products, and then talking about IEC 62304 for some of these more development practices. This doesn't tie in directly to the risk assessment methodology, which is, of course, a very vital concern. Now, for risk assessment methodologies, we have some techniques that we've developed in-house that make sure we have complete coverage of any of the FDA concerns. And so we were able to help guide this manufacturer through some of those techniques and make sure they were able to get to their FDA clearance goal in the end. We can talk about another case study that we've seen here, which is problems within USB interfaces. This is an extremely common vulnerability for us to identify some sort of risk in a USB interface. And in this case specifically, USB port was used for flashing updates onto the device. Now, when you're dealing with a USB port, and I'm sure anyone watching this, seeing from their computer or from their phone, is probably aware you can plug a lot of different things into the USB port. I'm looking at my laptop right now. I have 2 adapters plugged into it, a charger, a mouse, a camera, a microphone. All of these are going into the same type of interface to provide that functionality. Generally, USB ports are going to have these different levels of functionality by default. You're going to have to pare back what they can do. So if you have a USB interface intended only for updates, but you can plug in a mouse, you can plug in a keyboard, you can plug in an emulator or a tool that is trying to replicate one of these with really fast scripts to effectively try to hack into the product, and it is not recognized as a risk, that is going to be a major problem in the device. For any startup or for any medical device manufacturers planning on integrating USB into your device, pay attention here and make sure you are only allowing what you would expect to see. Now, this was the case with this device specifically. It should only have expected to see removable media with update installation packages, but instead it was allowing us to plug in anything. Our solution was going to be pretty easy. We made sure that we had code signing on any update packages. We had hardware restrictions, only allowing removable storage and not allowing human interface devices. And then we aligned our full development and patching process with IEC 62304. This led to the manufacturer getting their CE mark and HSA clearance without any further queries about what was going on with that USB interface. Now, the next case study that I want to talk about, and this is going to be especially important with regulators such as the PMDA that try to harmonize around the FDA's post-market strategy, is that cyber device was treated as post-market only. So we weren't covering any of these initial concerns. Now, this is something that can come up where a manufacturer understands they need to go through certain penetration testing, they need to go through certain testing on the device, but they don't understand some of the quality documentation that'll go around it. This is very common when the strategy and the back-end process is strong, but the documentation and the evidence is not going to be as strong. Very important to present this information as much as possible to the regulators. So our strategy to make sure that we were helping this manufacturer get to a good state of cyber hygiene to get ready for their PMDA submission was moving backwards into that pre-market assessment. We wanted to work with them on their documentation, on the strategy around it. Since their processes were all intact and very strong, they just didn't have the documentation built out to support it. With this in mind, we were able to build out a technical file that was going forward to the PMDA, and that led to their approved submission. Now, another one that I want to talk about, and this is something that is very important to think about, especially now that cybersecurity is becoming a more relevant concern, is investor confidence. We've actually seen more and more, especially I would say the investors that we partner with, since we're a bit more in their ear about the problems with cybersecurity, we're seeing a lot of these venture capitalists and investors come in with concerns around not seeing cybersecurity addressed in a roadmap or not seeing cybersecurity addressed within product development. This can lead to a lack of investor confidence, which is obviously going to lead to a lack of funding if the device is not seen as mature and ready. What we were able to do is help start with some of these initial cybersecurity assessments, these preliminary audits, and make sure that they're building out the processes first before they're even diving into any of the development around their device. So this isn't to say that cybersecurity needs to start on a finished product. And I think this case study talks about a great situation where we were working with a company that did not have their product yet. They had their strategy, they had a great idea, they wanted to bring it to market, but they needed to have some more confidence and some more process around the development to make sure that everything was going to be compliant. We were able to help them with this process, and they're able to build back that investor confidence and secure their funding that they needed to continue the development of their product.
Yeah, it's not a good scenario when a innovator that got funding from an investor gets a rejection from the FDA or another global regulatory body because of cybersecurity. It's hard to go back and ask for more money after a couple of these sort of scenarios.
It can be really hard, and especially with all of the focus on cybersecurity right now.
Yeah.
I know I mentioned earlier, it's the number one reason the FDA sends back AINN letters for medical devices. When we are providing confidence that we're not going to get those letters for cybersecurity, it's just a lot less risk for the investor's portfolio.
Yep.
All right. Now, this is just kind of tying back into that point where we're saying we want to make sure that you are getting cybersecurity ready early on in this process. I do want to tie back into that last case study that we were talking about and elaborate a little bit on what I mean there. When we have a medical device that we're developing, there's a lot of stuff that goes into the process around the development, the different checks where we're going to perform different testing, and it's important to build this out before you are actually developing your product. So have your risk management framework in place, have a life cycle approach to the JSP2 in place before you're moving into any of the actual development there. This is going to provide a lot of maturity in your product, and this is going to be a very positive signal towards investors. Now, post-market cybersecurity expectations are something that can shift and be a little bit different from the pre-market. Some of the things that we want to talk about, the FDA outlines their concerns. They want to see different levels of continuous monitoring. So we talked about continuous SBOM tracking, regular penetration testing, regular static testing. They want to see that You have methods to intake third-party resources, be this through coordinated vulnerability disclosure or through monitoring of third-party news sources, and that you have this total product lifecycle and patch validation approach. Now, the FDA and regulators want to see devices that can receive updates. You don't necessarily have to have devices that can receive updates, but it is a good look, and it is a bit more of a push in the direction where you can address cybersecurity risks as they come up. Now, this needs to be done securely, but having a process to address cybersecurity risks in the post-market phase is very important and will provide regulatory confidence when you're moving forward into those submissions. All right, we can go ahead and dive into some of the most important details that we'd covered. I know there was a lot of information, so we'll leave you with the distilled version here. Now, if we're looking at what you need to pick as far as the most important standards to go through here, ISO 14971, AMI TIR 57. This is going to be your bread and butter for risk management. You have your safety covered and you have your cybersecurity covered. When we're looking at the development practices, we want to see something such as IEC 62304. This is going to talk about your software lifecycle, the full development process going into the device, your safety classification, and some important information there. We're also going to want to see coverage around these lifecycle approaches, things such as the JSP2, things such as IEC 81001-5-1, and then moving into the quality documentation. We talk about the IMDRF for a global lifecycle approach, looking into your specific regulator. If you're getting ready for the FDA, understand what goes into eStar. If you're looking to submit to EU, understand what documentation you need ready to get a CE mark. So know what you're looking for as far as the quality documentation, not just the process on the back end. Some of the most important points and some of the key things that I want to cover again here is going to be that cybersecurity should be about patient safety. We can't just have that focus around confidentiality, integrity, and availability. If you aren't sure about a cyber device, it can be a little bit of a tricky question, but the long story short is if you have software and if you have connectivity, it's a cyber device. Exactly how far that connectivity goes, that can be a little bit of the trickier question, but we're always available as a resource to help you have that conversation as well. Cybersecurity should be covered as a lifecycle approach. This is not a one-time study. You can't just have it done initially and then move on from there. You need to make sure it's a continual cycle. You're continuously going through cybersecurity testing, updating your documentation, and making sure that you are not letting anything slip through the cracks. When you're choosing a either in-house or outsourced developer, be sure that they understand regulated frameworks. They know things such as IEC 62304, the documentation that goes into ISO 13485, and that they are not just doing things with that move fast and break things mindset that is unfortunately all too common within the tech space. The final thing is that regulated and medical cybersecurity is different from IT cybersecurity. Dealing with infrastructure, dealing with networks, dealing with log monitoring and security alerts is a lot different than dealing with a product, understanding specific vulnerabilities that can lead to safety effectiveness. So understand you may need some different teams for these different approaches here. All right, now, for any of these questions that we've talked about, if you aren't exactly sure where to start, this is where it's a great time to reach out to us and see how we can help out there. We're always happy to start the conversation, see how we can help you meet your cybersecurity goals. We've worked across all of these different global regulators, and we have a very deep understanding of exactly what they want to see here. We've done quite a few penetration tests and documentation submissions within medical devices, around 250 successful clearances at this point. And so if you need any help navigating some of these complicated regulations, we want to be there as your partner to help you through that process.
All right, awesome. We'll see if we have stick around for another minute or so, see if anyone has any questions before we wrap up. Great job as usual, Trevor. I think I'm talked out for like a month.
I think I know later today we've got quite a few podcast recordings as well. I think after today I'll be talked out for a month.
I know we have a couple today. Cool.
And I've got the dentist immediately after this, so it doesn't end.
I have still not gone to the dentist since we've talked about it like a year ago. I'm refusing to go.
I'm giving up on that one.
No, you sent me your dentist, so I need to like look into it and do it. I don't know.
He's a good dentist.
All right. All right. Doesn't seem like we have any more questions here. So go ahead and wrap up. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll see you next month. We haven't decided the topic next month. If you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, feel free to drop in the comments, and we'll make sure we cover it as well. We try to cover the things that we feel will add the most value. So if there's a burning question or topic that you feel has not been explained very well, we're happy to cover it. Have a great Christmas, not Thanksgiving, and happy holidays, everyone.
Happy holidays.
All right.